Have you ever wondered why that moment of pleasure never lasts? Why the chocolate melts, the high fades, and you're left reaching for more? What if I told you that everything you think you know about pleasure is a lie? What if the very thing you believe brings you joy is actually keeping you trapped in a cycle of emptiness? Imagine this. You're standing in front of a mirror, but instead of seeing your reflection, you see a stranger. Someone who scrolls endlessly through their phone, who eats when they're not hungry, who buys things they don't need, who seeks validation from people who don't truly know them. This stranger looks tired even when they're smiling. They look hungry even when they're full. They look lonely even when they're surrounded by distraction. That stranger is you. And that stranger is all of us, caught in what Carl Jung called the shadow of modern pleasure. Here's the question that will change everything. When was the last time you felt truly satisfied? Not momentarily pleased, not temporarily distracted, but deeply, completely fulfilled without needing anything more? Can't remember? That's because we've been trained to mistake escape for enjoyment, numbness for peace, and stimulation for satisfaction. Let me paint you a picture of your typical day. You wake up, and before your feet hit the floor, your hand reaches for your phone. There's no emergency, no burning curiosity, just an automatic response stronger than thirst. You scroll through images of lives that aren't yours, news that makes you anxious, and memes that make you smile for exactly 3 seconds before you've already forgotten them. Minutes turn into an hour, and suddenly you're late for your own life. You grab something sweet or caffeinated, not because you're hungry, but because you need fuel for the performance ahead. At work, you check social media between tasks, not because you're bored, but because the silence between activities feels unbearable. You eat lunch while watching videos, unable to sit alone with your thoughts and a sandwich. The evening comes and you collapse into entertainment, binge watching shows that you'll barely remember tomorrow. But here's what's really happening beneath the surface. Every single one of these moments is a tiny betrayal of your authentic self. You're not choosing pleasure, you're choosing anesthesia. You're not living, you're managing the discomfort of being alive. Jung understood something that modern psychology often misses. Our compulsions aren't about what we're seeking, but about what we're avoiding. Every mindless scroll, every unnecessary purchase, every relationship that starts with intensity and ends with emptiness, every craving that returns minutes after being satisfied, these aren't symptoms of too little pleasure in your life. They're symptoms of too little presence. The shadow, as Jung called it, isn't just the dark parts of your personality you don't want to acknowledge. It's also the parts of yourself you've abandoned in favor of quick fixes and easy escapes. It's the child inside you who learned that feeling bad gets you nothing, but performing happiness gets you attention. It's the teenager who discovered that certain behaviors could make the loneliness disappear, at least temporarily. It's the adult who has become so skilled at distraction that they've forgotten what they were originally trying to distract themselves from. Think about the last time you felt guilty after a moment of pleasure. After watching one more episode when you should have slept, after eating something you didn't really want, after spending money you didn't have on something you didn't need, after sending that text you knew you shouldn't send. That guilt isn't because you did something morally wrong. It's because some part of you recognized that you weren't being fed, you were being sedated. This is the deception at the heart of modern pleasure. We've been sold the idea that more stimulation equals more satisfaction, that constant entertainment equals happiness, that the absence of boredom equals the presence of joy. But the opposite is true. The more we chase external pleasures to fill internal voids, the deeper those voids become. The tragedy isn't that we seek pleasure. The tragedy is that we've forgotten what real pleasure feels like. We've become so accustomed to the artificial highs that the natural rhythms of contentment feel boring by comparison. We've trained our nervous systems to expect constant stimulation, making peace feel like punishment and silence feel like suffering. But what if there was another way? What if the very discomfort you're trying to escape is actually the path to the fulfillment you're seeking? Let's travel back to where this all began. You're 6 years old and you fall off your bike. Your knee is bleeding and you're crying. What happens next shapes everything that follows. Maybe someone rushes over with a Band-Aid and a cookie, saying, "Don't cry, here's something sweet to make it better." Maybe you're told to toughen up and given a toy to distract you from the pain, or maybe you're simply ignored until you stop making noise. In that moment, your young brain makes a crucial connection. Pain is unacceptable, but pleasure is the solution. Feeling bad gets you nothing, but the right kind of performance gets you attention, comfort, and relief. This isn't conscious learning. It's neural programming that will influence every choice you make for decades to come. As you grow, this programming becomes more sophisticated. You learn that certain behaviors can change your internal state almost instantly. A certain food can shift your mood. A certain activity can quiet your mind. A certain person can make you feel worthy. What you don't realize is that you're not just learning how to feel better, you're learning how to avoid feeling altogether. By adolescence, you've become fluent in the language of distraction. You know exactly which pleasures to reach for when specific discomforts arise. Boredom leads to scrolling, loneliness leads to romantic drama, anxiety leads to shopping or eating, sadness leads to binge watching or substance use. You've developed a sophisticated internal pharmacy, and you're both the patient and the pharmacist. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. Every time you replace an authentic emotion with a synthetic pleasure, you lose a piece of your relationship with yourself. You're not just avoiding pain, you're avoiding the information that pain carries. You're not just seeking pleasure, you're abandoning the parts of yourself that need attention, not anesthesia. This is where the shadow work becomes crucial. Your shadow isn't just your repressed anger or hidden selfishness, it's also your unexpressed sadness, your unacknowledged fear, your unfelt loneliness. It's every emotion you've learned to immediately medicate rather than experience. And pleasure, when used unconsciously, becomes the most elegant form of self-abandonment ever invented. Consider the modern epidemic of anxiety and depression. We live in the most entertained, stimulated, pleasure-saturated society in human history, yet mental health issues are skyrocketing. This isn't coincidental. When you constantly override your body's natural emotional rhythms with artificial highs, you dysregulate your nervous system. You teach your brain that the baseline state of being human is unbearable, requiring constant external intervention. The result is a generation of people who can't sit in silence, who can't be alone without entertainment, who can't eat without distraction, who can't experience one emotion without immediately seeking to change it. We become allergic to our own inner experience, and pleasure has become the antihistamine we can't live without. But this creates a devastating paradox. The more we use pleasure to avoid discomfort, the more sensitive we become to discomfort. What used to be a manageable moment of boredom becomes an emergency requiring immediate stimulation. What used to be a normal feeling of loneliness becomes a crisis requiring instant connection or distraction. We've lowered our tolerance for the full spectrum of human experience, making ourselves dependent on external sources of regulation. Jung called this participation mystique, the inability to distinguish between your internal state and external circumstances. When you can't tolerate your own inner world, you become enslaved to anything that promises to change it. You lose your center, your ability to remain stable regardless of what's happening around you. The cruel irony is that the very pleasures we think are saving us are actually preventing us from developing the psychological muscles we need to handle life's inevitable challenges. Every time we immediately medicate discomfort with pleasure, we miss the opportunity to build resilience, to learn that we can survive difficult emotions, to discover that we are more capable than we think. This is why Jung emphasized the importance of holding tension rather than immediately resolving it. When you can sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for relief, something magical happens. You realize that emotions are temporary, that you are not your feelings, and that you have the capacity to be present with whatever arises. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter, where the comfortable lies we tell ourselves begin to crumble. You see, the trap isn't that pleasure exists, it's that we've forgotten the difference between pleasure and medication. We've become so skilled at using stimulation to manage our internal states that we've lost touch with what genuine satisfaction feels like. Real pleasure has a quality that artificial pleasure lacks. It expands you rather than contracts you. It connects you to yourself rather than disconnecting you from reality. It leaves you feeling more present, not less. It satisfies rather than creating more craving. It integrates rather than fragments. Think about the difference between eating a meal when you're genuinely hungry versus eating to cope with stress. The first expands your awareness. You taste the food. You feel gratitude. You're present with the experience. The second contracts your awareness. You barely taste what you're consuming, you're distracted by other things, and you often feel worse afterward. This same distinction applies to every area of life. There's a difference between connecting with someone because you enjoy their company and connecting with someone because you can't tolerate being alone. There's a difference between engaging with entertainment because it enriches your life and consuming entertainment because silence feels unbearable. There's a difference between sexual intimacy that expresses love and sexual activity that medicates loneliness. The trap is that artificial pleasure often mimics the external features of real pleasure while delivering the opposite internal experience. Social media mimics social connection while often increasing loneliness. Shopping mimics the satisfaction of acquiring what you need while often increasing anxiety about what you lack. Binge watching mimics the pleasure of storytelling while often leaving you feeling emptier than before. Jung understood that this confusion between authentic and artificial pleasure is one of the primary obstacles to psychological development. When you can't distinguish between what truly nourishes you and what merely distracts you, you remain trapped in patterns that prevent growth. But here's where the real work begins. Recognizing the trap is only the first step. The next step is developing the courage to choose differently, even when it feels uncomfortable. This means learning to pause between stimulus and response, to ask yourself what you truly need in any given moment, to choose presence over escape. This is where most people get stuck. They recognize the patterns, they understand the theory, but they can't seem to break free from the behaviors that keep them trapped. This is because changing these patterns requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires a fundamental shift in how you relate to discomfort. The truth is that real pleasure often comes through discipline, not despite it. The most satisfying meals follow periods of genuine hunger. The most meaningful relationships require the discipline to be present during difficult conversations. The most fulfilling work requires the discipline to persist through challenges. The most profound peace requires the discipline to sit with uncomfortable emotions rather than immediately escaping them. This doesn't mean becoming ascetic or avoiding all pleasure. It means becoming conscious about your relationship with pleasure, learning to distinguish between what serves your growth and what prevents it, developing the capacity to choose presence over avoidance. When you begin to make this distinction, something remarkable happens. You start to enjoy things more fully because you're actually present for them. You start to need less because you're getting more satisfaction from what you have. You start to feel more stable because you're not constantly seeking external regulation of your internal state. The paradox is that the less you need pleasure, the more you're able to enjoy it. When you're not desperate for the next hit of stimulation, you can actually taste your food, actually listen to music, actually connect with other people. When you're not using pleasure as medication, it can return to its natural function as celebration. Here we reach the culmination of our journey, the moment when everything shifts. You've seen through the illusion, recognized the trap, and now you stand at the threshold of a different way of being. This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes not just a psychological theory, but a lived reality. Individuation isn't about becoming perfect or eliminating all pleasure from your life. It's about becoming whole, integrated, able to respond to life from a place of centeredness rather than compulsion. It's about reaching a state where you can enjoy pleasure without being enslaved by it, where you can tolerate discomfort without being destroyed by it. Imagine waking up in the morning and not immediately reaching for your phone. Instead, you lie there for a moment, feeling the weight of your body in the bed, noticing your breath, acknowledging whatever emotions are present without needing to change them. You get up when you're ready, not when you're running from stillness. Imagine eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're satisfied. Imagine engaging with entertainment because it genuinely enriches your life, not because you can't bear to be alone with your thoughts. Imagine forming relationships based on genuine connection rather than the need to escape loneliness. Imagine making choices from a place of clarity rather than compulsion. This isn't about becoming some kind of enlightened being who never experiences pleasure. It's about becoming someone who can distinguish between what truly serves them and what merely provides temporary relief. It's about developing what Jung called conscious suffering, the ability to be present with difficult emotions without immediately seeking escape. When you develop this capacity, something profound happens. You realize that most of your suffering wasn't actually caused by your circumstances, but by your resistance to your circumstances. You discover that you can handle much more than you thought you could. You find that the very emotions you've been avoiding often contain the wisdom you've been seeking. This is the true liberation, not the absence of challenge, but the presence of capacity. Not the elimination of desire, but the freedom to choose which desires to follow. Not the avoidance of pain, but the confidence that you can meet whatever arises with presence and wisdom. People will notice the change in you. They'll comment that you seem more grounded, more present, more genuinely content. They might not understand why you don't need to be constantly entertained, why you can sit in silence, why you don't immediately reach for your phone when there's a lull in conversation. They might even feel uncomfortable around your presence because it reflects their own relationship with avoidance. But you'll know the secret. True pleasure isn't about getting what you want. It's about not needing to want. It's about finding such richness in the present moment that you don't need to escape it. It's about becoming so comfortable with your own inner landscape that you don't need constant external stimulation to feel okay. This is Jung's vision of psychological maturity. Not the absence of shadow, but the integration of shadow. Not the elimination of pleasure, but the conscious relationship with pleasure. Not the avoidance of suffering, but the transformation of suffering into wisdom. The journey doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning. Because once you've tasted this kind of freedom, you'll never again be satisfied with the artificial substitutes. You'll continue to grow, to discover new layers of consciousness, to find ever deeper sources of satisfaction that don't depend on external circumstances. And perhaps most importantly, you become a beacon for others who are still trapped in the cycle of artificial pleasure and genuine suffering. Your presence alone will demonstrate that another way is possible, that freedom is real, and that the very thing they think they need to escape, their own authentic experience, is actually the doorway to everything they've been seeking. The pleasure you don't need to chase is indeed the only kind worth having. And now that you know this, you'll never look at pleasure the same way again.